Well, there are already schools and hospitals being built. We don't need that site for it. But, if you want to replace the mosque in Mecca or in Ajmer or so with a hospital, then please go ahead. And after that, maybe we can consider Ayodhya, but first you do that. And so you see, I think there's a place for temples also. And so this is one. I mean, in any other place, Ram wasn't born, he was born there. So we'll have a temple there. Even if you don't believe in Rama, even if you're a secularist, even if you're a Muslim, you can respect your fellow men who do care about that side. And so, totally regardless of the history, the fact that today Hindus go to Ayodhya is reason enough to leave the site to the Hindus.
Thank you very much for the warm introduction and the warm welcome. It's growing cold, and we needed that to start with. Uh, since it's a conversation about Ayodhya, I thought it apt to start with a small prayer to Bhagwan Ram. And if I can request all of you to maybe join me in that. I don't know how many of you pray to him every day. I'm sure in some way you do. But this is a prayer which is very universal. So I thought I'll start with that. Um, नीलाम्बुजश्यामलकोमलाङ्गं सीतासमारोपितवामभागं पाणुमाशायतु चार्चापं नमामि रामं रघुवंशनाथं नमामि रामं रघुवंशनाथम्. Thank you very much for having us here at the DU Lit Fest. The front lawns are near to freezing. And I'll try to keep the conversation as warm as possible with, on one side, on my right side, having Konrad, and on the other, having a litigator who's, I'm sure, going to be very incisive with his own set of inputs and questions, Podu Raju sir. So, welcome to both of you, sir. Uh, Ayodhya has a very historical, cultural, political, and social significance in our lives, and it is only natural. And we are the kind of ecstatic feeling you see, the fervor you see all across India and the world with the Ayodhya and the Janmabhoomi. Finally, Lord Ram coming back and being, placed back, getting his home back at Ayodhya Ram Janmabhoomi. It is only apt to start this conversation with that first question. And that question is to you, Kunrad. Why is it that it still continues, Ayodhya continues to capture the sensibilities, the collective consciousness of people, even after hundreds and thousands of years? Especially, uh, one can't even imagine that the battle has been on for the last, especially legally, has been on for the last 490, 500 odd years. So, what is it about the Janmabhoomi that actually captures that?
Well, it helps that people have been fighting for it so long. The number that's mostly given is like 500 years. That is more or less true in the sense that the temple has been demolished in 1030 by Salar Masud Ghaznavi, the nephew of Mahmud Ghaznavi. It has been rebuilt. Then you get a large temple of which now the foundations and so on have been dug up. So that's towards 1100. That gets demolished by Shah Zuran Ghori, who was also the nephew of a conqueror of Muhammad Ghori. And that's in 1194. And so I think that is when the temple got demolished. You see, the usual narrative is that it got demolished in 1526 to 1528 by Babar. That I think is very definitely not the case. Why? Because the temple could not have remained standing under a sultanate regime for 333 years, whereas the sultanate regime was the single most iconoclastic regime in world history. You know, they destroyed the Kashi Vishwanath, they destroyed Nalanda University and so on. They destroyed everything in the Ganga plain. Why would they have allowed this temple to stand? So Babar found an already ready-made mosque, and this has been said at the time of the evidence research by uh, architects and art historians from both the pro-temple and the anti-temple camp. You know, they say it's a typical Sultanate mosque. It must be from like 1300 AD. And what Babar did was to destroy the renewed Hindu presence there. You see, in the last years of the Lodi dynasty, there was chaos, there was civil war, and so on. In those circumstances, Hindus who always try to come back to the site must have seen a chance to retake it, but it was not yet safe to actually take it apart and build a real temple there. So they did exactly what they did between 1949 and 1992. They used a mosque building as a temple. And so it is that which Babar again demolished or, you know, destroyed in 1528. Then the struggle starts, but it's not always a struggle in the sense that Hindus are always on the defensive. You see, you get Akbar, who at some point in his career becomes tolerant and allows the rebuilding of temples, like the Krishna Janmabhoomi, like the Somnath temple. And so in Ayodhya, nothing is rebuilt because the mosque building was still standing there. However, it was fully used as a Hindu pilgrimage place, as testified essentially by Tulsidas, who lived precisely at that time, and by several Western travelers who came by there. They describe Hindu festivals, Hindu pilgrimage. They never mention Muslims. And so it is only in around 1800 that the local Nawabs, just as the Muslim regime around them of the Mughal dynasty is collapsing on all sides, then exactly they managed to restore it as a mosque, to restart Muslim worship there. And so that remains. The British don't want to be bothered, you know, so status quo until 1936 when they send everybody away because of riots. And so then it is that Hindus manage to, you know, reinstall the idols and so on. But so it's in those 500 years that there was a to and fro. There were two sides to the struggle. Whereas beforehand, under the Sultanate regime, the Hindus had no chance at all.
Thank you for setting that context and giving
Mm.
a bit of that to the audience here. A lot of them are young. I'm not sure how many of them have actually read through the historical documents that actually provide the proof of Bhagwan Ram's, Janmabhoomi being there. But that also brings me to you, Poduraju sir, that, what is it? And since you have been part of that struggle in a way, you've played your own role in ensuring that there is a verdict and there is a decision that one arrives at. And I think we are जिसे हम कहते हैं सौभाग्य है हमारा कि हमारे इस जन्म के दौरान हम ये देख पा रहे हैं. But what is it about the Hindu grit and the commitment, and especially that comes from the proof that was put forth at the Supreme Court, which I would like you to share that bit. What is it that actually made them hold on to that commitment that no, we are going to not let this go?
It's a very intriguing question that even I faced when I got into this matter. I mean, I'm a practicing professional lawyer in the Supreme Court, so I was not really engaged with ideologies or probably politics at any point of time, as either as a student or as a professional. So when I got into this matter, I thought probably, as everyone else would think, that this is a matter which is probably political, like what people are discussing over 9 o'clock debates every day. But when I got to read the facts and the evidence and the material which has come on record, that's quite shocking to say the least. What happened is that the invasions did happen as a matter of fact, which is not denied. Story of Civilization by Will Durant records it and documents it, and it's actually accepted across as a credible narration of events as transpired. Now, if you look at this issue, I mean, there are two aspects to any problem. There was a political aspect of the religion that invaded India, and there was a spiritual aspect of the Sanatani defense of the place. So political power was lost, as probably as Mr. Kunrad has highlighted, sometime in around 1000 AD. So once the political power was lost, the temples were at the mercy of the iconoclasts. But what is it that the Sanatan Dharma, or the people of this land who believed in certain things and certain values, kept fighting? At a point of time, a single man standing there, two people joining hands, and then that became probably a caravan, as we see, which eventually led to the judgment that we got in 2019. So the spiritual grit of this land is a pursuit of truth, a pursuit of dharma. This is a land of dharma. This is not a land of a book or a god. This is a land of dharma where even the people we elevate to the status of a god, be they we are worshippers of nature, so we call them Varun Dev, we call Vayu Dev. So basically, we deify whomever comes to our aid. So now I think we regularly refer to Google Mata as much whenever we are in need of some reference. So therefore, we deify anyone who comes to our aid, because we believe that Daivam Manushya Rupena is how the help is sent and received. So therefore, that again goes to your core philosophical concept of Sanatana, which is Advaita, where there is non-duality. When we are talking about non-duality, there is there is a Jivatma and a Paramatma, as we call it, and we believe that there is a Paramatma existing in every Jivatma. So when it comes to fasting, etc., I say that there is a Ram residing in me and I can't starve him. So therefore, that's my excuse not to fast on Shivratri or any other day. But be that as it may, now when come back to Ayodhya, what has happened there is Ram is the yardstick or the benchmark on which every human conduct is measured up to. I'm going to Ayodhya and I wanted to write a piece before I left Delhi. So I'll be leaving tomorrow morning. So I couldn't sleep last night. And today morning, I actually completed an article on this issue. I feel that we have actually achieved a political freedom probably in 1947, economic freedom maybe in 1990s. But this epitomizes the 2019 judgment, and the Pran Pratishtha happening on 22nd January is the spiritual liberation, which is the final the string that we were holding back. Because if you look at the ecosystem which was controlling our thought process, the narratives, that what we get to read, what we would discuss, and how it would be presented, has been shattered over the past few years. Thanks to social media, people started questioning, people started researching. Someone who's from a commerce background like me and who's taken to law as a profession got to read a lot about historiography, the way history was written. And then I discovered it actually aligned with the manner in which the history has been written in our land. But the spiritual aspect of the connect that people have with Ram as a benchmark or a yardstick is what actually kept that idea of Ayodhya being pillaged, which hurt a lot of people. As we keep seeing a lot of data, for 500 years, Suryavanshi Thakurs have not worn leather chappal or their pagadi. So that's a pain which is carried through for generations. How many of us can even sacrifice using of a mobile for a day? What to speak about generations? So therefore, that is the depth of the connect, which is purely spiritual, which is transcended probably about 20 or 30 generations. So that is the reason that has actually come out. And then we as a culture or a civilization believe in rebirth. So that probably is the reason we are able to relate to certain things which are beyond our lifetimes or the lifetimes of the people that we've seen living around us.
I would like you to hold the thought on the diversity and the tolerance part, and I'll come back to you with a question on that. But Kunrad, I wanted to ask you, Professor, uh, in what Podu Raju sir shared about generations of crit that the Sanatanis and the Hindu Dharma practitioners have shown, what kind of evidence? See, and he also mentioned about Google being the guru these days. What we don't find in Google is, I mean, a lot is still unanswered about what exactly was there, which uh, worked in favor of the Hindus in terms of the historical and archaeological aspect. If you could just share that part.
Mhm. Well, simply the historical reality that of necessity had to leave certain traces behind. So we can verify both archaeologically and in documents that these things happened. And we would have had even more, with a little bit of good luck, we would have had the relevant pages of Babar's own diary. But you see, it is written in his own diary at a later date that the pages for that particular time when he was in Ayodhya have been blown away during a windstorm. So, unfortunately, the very best evidence we could have had has gone missing. So, it can't be used either way. But there's still plenty more. Like, for instance, one of the first pieces of evidence that was presented during the recent, 1989 scholars debate was a paper by Arun Shauri, where he discusses four different pieces of documentary evidence from Muslim sources. And there are many more, but he highlighted those four because with those four, attempts have been made to conceal them or to tamper with them. Because that's also a problem we've had that the anti-temple party, played, well, foul play. Um, but at any rate, the evidence was simply there, and it was not on their side. You see, they themselves justified that. They said, "Yeah, we don't offer evidence because we don't say anything happened. It's you who say that a temple was built and that the temple was demolished. So you have to prove that, and we have done that. But we don't claim anything, so we don't have to prove anything." That's not true, because if you say that the mosque was built on virgin land, that is also something you can prove. You see, maybe there was a forest there, and Babar saw this landscape, and he said, "Wow, beautiful, exactly fit for a mosque." And then he found out, you see, who is the owner. He drew up a sales contract, bought the land, built a mosque. Now, that sales contract must be somewhere in some judicial or administrative building. And so a real historian would go look for it. And that has not been done. You see, the so called eminent historians, the anti temple historians who always praised one another as eminent, they were so sure of their case that they didn't make any effort at all. Because at the time, the media especially created this impression that obviously there was no temple there. And so they hadn't expected that the pro temple historians would rather easily give a whole collection of evidence.
I'm sure that would have also been a big reason for, to have won the case. But that's it's a very interesting point that Conrad shared about Shorey's book. Citing from Shorey's book about the four, documents that actually prove from the Muslim perspective. But it's not just about the documentation. I also, read in one of your articles, and as I was mentioning it to you a while back, that there were, in fact, any dispositions, and there were Muslims who act in who's accepted, and that was also one of the reasons why the case went in favor of, or the way it did.
Yes, in fact, as a matter of court records, there was a case during the British period in around 1885. It was carried to an appeal and a second appeal as much. There, the British judge records that it's unfortunate that the holiest place for Hindus, the birthplace of Rama, has been demolished and now it's rechristened as a mosque. That apart, the Muazzin who calls out the azan also had made complaints, and in one of the depositions they come out and very honestly make a statement. Insofar as is concerned, from times immemorial they've been believing that the place of birth was always under the central dome, and this is on affidavits, on oath before a court of law, and they were put to cross examination as much to testify, to verify if their statements were true or false. So it is the best possible evidence that one can have. A deponent comes forward to the court, takes an oath, and thereafter is put to cross examination. So he's actually tested for his credibility. So several Muslims have over a period of decades, in fact, some of the written statements, which is the responses filed in the pleading stage, have categorically made statements that in case it is found that the structure is built on any pre-existing building, we will hand it over to the Hindus. But unfortunately, it was not to be. Several depositions have come on record of Muslims of Ayodhya in 1949, 1950, that they actually would not want to retain the position of these premises and hand it over. It is actually purely politics which has kept this case alive for 70 years. There was no reason for this case to have prolonged for 70 years. Mind you, the suit was filed on 16 January 1950. That was 10 days before India became a republic. On 26 January 1950, the constitution had come into force. So this is a suit which went on trial from 1950, and the other suits joined over a period of time. Eventually, Ramlala Virajman had himself come to court in 1989, stating that three suits pending on this issue, where issues are framed, have been lying in the trial stage for 30 years, and there's no hope for justice. Think of it. I mean, just imagine any other country or any other culture where a DT would come to court and say, "Boss, please expedite my hearing," like any other litigant or a citizen would do. And even after that intervention of 1989, the suit was adjudicated after evidence and trial only in the year 2010 on the original side by the High Court. Thereafter, the appeals reached Supreme Court, and it took about 9 years in Supreme Court for the appeals to be ripened for a hearing. So just look at the timeline we are talking about.
This was especially when the High Court gave an
The High Court had actually tried to partition the premises, the central dome to the Hindus, a part of it to the claims of a Akhada, Nirmohi Akhada, who claims Shabiatship, and the part of it to the Muslims, because it was unworkable. Because none of the parties who came to court asked for a partition. They claimed an absolute right over the entire premises as a civil right. Like if you have a neighbor and you disputing the claim of a piece of land, there's no question of a partition there. Either it's your land or his land. There's no way of partitioning. That partitioning could be possible if you go for a private or a court arranged mediation where you reconcile your claims to buy peace. So therefore, parties were never inclined to settle the matter. So that's probably the reason everyone came in appeal to the Supreme Court.
But one thing, one takeaway from your what you just said, Podu Raju sir, is that a man of faith, a person of faith, will always stand by the truth, and that is the reason
Absolutely.
why.
See, a man of faith fears God and the judgment day. So therefore, he is not looking at the mortals who are watching him or not watching him. He is actually looking at beyond life. So therefore, that fear of post life is what ensures, or that's probably what triggers the conscience of a human to conduct himself when nobody else is watching. Because you are your own best judge of your conduct. And the witness to your conduct would be probably your conscience.
True. Professor Kunrad, if we have a young audience here, and if you were to tell them, and you did mention about the so-called historians who worked against the interest of the truth, if you would like to put it that way, in for the young audience, what do you suggest it means about Bharat and about it being the land of dharma, with the pran pratishtha that is going to take
Yes.
place on the 22nd? What is it that they should, because I feel a lot of youngsters today ask the same questions कि school क्यों नहीं बना सकते वहाँ hospitals क्यों नहीं बना सकते, it is why aren't we constructing schools and hospitals there? So what do you what would you like to say about
Yes.
that?
Well, there are already schools and hospitals being built. We don't need that site for it. But, if you want to replace the mosque in Mecca or in Ajmer or so with a hospital, then please go ahead. And after that, maybe we can consider Ayodhya. But first, you do that. And so, you see, I think there's a place for temples also. And so this is one. I mean, in any other place, Ram wasn't born, he was born there. So we'll have a temple there. Of course, we as historians have had great fun, all these years with the Ayodhya affair, because, it's a good feeling to win the debate. But you see, even though that we won the debate fair and square against those who denied that there was a temple there, nevertheless, our work, our history work, strictly speaking, is not important and shouldn't have been necessary at all. Why? Well, you look at the state of this place today. No Muslim ever goes on pilgrimage there. Indeed, if no riots have taken place after the court verdict in 2010, it was precisely because the Muslims didn't care. They had no stake in Ayodhya. It was very artificially, egged on by the secularists, by the eminent historians. But, in reality, it's a Hindu site. Hindus go on pilgrimage there. Therefore, every secular government in the world would leave the site to the people who use it. You see, in France, you have a place for the Virgin Mary that only Catholics go to. All the secularists in the French government laugh at this superstition, yet they organize these pilgrimages. They facilitate, everything for pilgrimage for the people who do go there. So similarly, even if you don't believe in Rama, even if you're a secularist, even if you're a Muslim, you can respect your fellow men who do care about that side. And so, totally regardless of the history, the fact that today Hindus go to Ayodhya is reason enough to leave the site to the Hindus.
What would you like to share in terms of the kind of challenges that even fighting the legal battle, while fighting the legal battle, the challenges faced, but also the social challenges faced by people who were part of that battle for so many years and centuries, especially in the modern times, where narratives are built and they are created and false narratives are created, and that is what actually makes these youngsters question as to why not a hospital or a school. What is the need? So what was the need really socially?
Yeah. Before I answer that question, let me address the question of school or hospital. India, as a civilizational state, it was always very scientific tempered. It allowed questioning and it encourages questioning because we are called the seekers. We always pursue truth and we keep inquiring. Our methodologies of debates, which are very documented, and unfortunately, it's not taught across the road in the campus where I studied my law, but is actually part of philosophy and logic that should be taught in law, but unfortunately, it's never taught there. The place where it is actually used and where we make a living out of it. So, that apart, what happens is our entire social structure and the ecosystem was premised on a hub, which was the temple ecosystem. Now, why would anyone actually attack a temple? Of course, for the gold, the ornaments, the wealth. In addition to all that, why did they have to actually, they could have just robbed and left, like what any robber would do or a thief would do. They actually had to destroy it. They had to actually probably do more. The reason being that unless you actually attack the hub, the spokes which are dependent on it, which sustain the society, cannot be disjointed or disconnected and put in a disarray. So, to conquer any society, what you require to do is to destroy their intellectual ability to fight you. And the intellectual ability was always centered on institutions of learning. The institutions of learning were repositories of science, medicine, and astronomy, astrology, all branches of learning which are evident from any of the ancient literature. If you touch them, you will actually get details. If you pick up Valmiki Ramayana, you will get to learn so much about geography, geology, zoology, apart from how the origin of multiple things. If you look at Mahabharata, you'll get administrative law, you get jurisprudence. So therefore, these are the wealth of knowledge, and these itihasas have actually used them as a contextual screenplay in which the story has been progressed. So now, to attack that, you had to attack the institution called the temple. Now, once an ecosystem of temple is established, it supports the entire structure of the society. Not everyone would be qualified to enter this campus and become a student here. So, like me, I am a BCom honors graduate, but I couldn't probably have got a seat here. I studied elsewhere. So, it takes some kind of a intellectual ability. Arhata is what probably I would call it as is Telugu. So, whether you have qualified, like when people actually talk about the discrimination, I'm digressing, but this is an important point. The discrimination that we talk about is that people were deprived of certain access to learning and knowledge. What is your nuclear non-proliferation is all about? Is it not discrimination? It is discrimination on the premise that only democracies can be trusted with certain kind of power. It is the discrimination to understand a person's ability to handle that power. Now, going back to the issues here, the attack on our temples was structured to disable the society and thereafter conquer us, which they successfully did. But again, why do we keep going back to temples? And then the claims, assertions of temple is actually very symbolic. We are a very symbolic society. For us, everything is a symbol. The moment you see something, it symbolizes something. We infer certain things. So that is a symbol of a spiritual strength that we get. The thought, probably it is placebo for a rationalist, but it could be something more for someone who's a believer. So that's the context in which this issue has to be looked at, not merely from a context of two diverse perspectives or diverse ways of worshipping God. Because for us, all inclusive, we are inclusive of Charvakas who don't believe in probably a tomorrow or afterlife. We believe in probably rituals. We believe in yagnas. We believe in knowledge pursuit. And Bhagavad Gita gives you all the options. Whichever path you practice sincerely, you'll reach me. So whether I take a mudrika to go to Satsang Enclave or I go via Chandni Chowk, I'm going to reach there. It's only a route. So therefore, this diversity is why we've accepted whichever form worship or faith had come into our culture. That never took away the essence of questioning, the freedom to challenge and a particular ideology or a particular worldview. That challenge is impermissible in Abrahamic faiths because they inherently have the concepts of inquisitions or probably even worse. So therefore, that concept you don't find it in Indic civilization, or it's any of the religions or so-called religions which are born here, because we actually question and we evolve, and we are an evolving society which is self-cleansing. All the social evils kept cleansing themselves. So that's the way probably we need to see this issue as much, that we've evolved and we've actually cleansed ourselves, and
And
we are
we
still
continue to
standing up
do
to
that.
question.
We continue to do that. We
Right. And
continue
then
to
as far as
abolish
the
some systems and
courts and
practices.
social challenges, we've been brainwashed by the literature which was forcibly brought into our texts, thanks to Macaulay and his followers, the Marxists. So they take the credit for what they did to this nation. And that was the third invasion, which was invisible, which actually also had been discovered and actually criticized at length by the Allahabad High Court as early as in 2010. None of us would have read the pages written criticizing these Marxist professors when they came to court to depose on oath, and then they were cross examined. If you look at their cross examinations, they actually admit that I've come to court to swear that there was no temple remnants. This is post ASI giving reports that there are structures there which are non Islamic, and in fact, they replicate Hindu temple construction styles. They have the courage. Look at the lack of integrity, is what I really felt pained. A professional without integrity is the worst that a society can have, especially in academia. And this is exactly the language used by the Allahabad High Court. It says that we trust our academicians to give us honest material. That is the reason we have the highest pedestal for a guru. But if the people in that position actually
Misuse them.
subsume their integrity for their ideology, then you cease to be a guru and you are actually a foot soldier or a sleeper cell for something else.
That is a very interesting point where I would like to bring you in, Professor Kunrad, because you being an academician yourself and, a guru, you know, uh, and I being from a literature world of literature, I do agree to the point that, how we've completely falsified the kind of existence that comes across through Tulsidasa and Valmiki's,
Mhm.
Ramayana and Ramcharitmanas. We call Ramayana mythology, whereas
Mhm.
it's an epic. Uh, in history, how much of a role, and especially for a historian, how much of a role did these two particular epics play in finding
Yes.
the truth?
Well, in terms of advertising certain virtues, of course, they have been enormously influential. But the question, what they have to do with history, is a little bit complicated. Um, so I hear many Hindus say nowadays that the Puranas and the Itihasas have to be taught as history, pure and simple. Now that's not true. Um, you see, they start with history. Rama was very definitely a historical person, as was Krishna, as was Yudhishthira, and so on. Very definitely, or Bharata, King Bharata, the starter of the Vedic tradition, after whom India was named Bharat. Okay, he was very definitely a historical person. However, as soon as this story falls in the hands of poets, then they start adding more fanciful elements, exaggerating, and so on. And so then it becomes essentially historical, but partly not. And then you should be more careful. So um, we have an example, for example, of the historicity of Rama when we compare the story as it is told by Valmiki with the archaeology. We see that the archaeology goes to a little bit less than 2000 BC, not beyond. So when Bibi Lal explained the archaeology to a gathering of Dharmacharyas, they were very happy when he said, yes, there was a temple there. But they were much less happy when he said, but the human habitation there does not go beyond 2000 BC. because they believed, oh, Rama was 7,000 BC or 900,000 years BC or so. That's not true. Rama must have lived about 1900 BC. Okay. And so, there you have to sift, you have to use your professional training and simply your common sense that, certain things are, like, for instance, the airplanes. In modern Hindi, Vimana means airplane. But originally, in architecture, Vimana meant a tower or a balcony on one of the upper stories of the tower, from which you could see the world downstairs. And so there, if you are a bit, I don't know, drunk or something, and you are on a balcony, you can easily imagine that it is moving, that you're moving across the world and so on. And so from there, you get the idea that Vimana is some kind of helicopter that Hanuman used. So, there you have other elements that are not so historical. And so, I wouldn't trust, very firm believers too much when it comes to handling that distinction. Many people absolutely want to believe that it is true to the last letter. That's something I know from Christianity, where you have people believing that the world existed since 6,000 years, not more. God created it in 6 days and so on. I mean, that can't be sustained in the time of the scientific temper. But so essentially, yes, it is historical.
Great. Uh, Poduraju sir, one last question before I open the forum to students to ask you both questions. And uh, what is it in the court of law? How did you, and since Konrad just mentioned the fact and the fiction of history, if you look at it that way. So, how did the court and those fighting the case from the end of the Hindus or the Sanatanis, how did they assimilate and differentiate between the fact and the fiction? How did that happen? Because that's a very, I mean, intriguing bit.
Right. I'll just give a backdrop as to how court comes to a conclusion on disputed questions of fact. There is something called pleadings. That is, you file a pleading or a plaint where you assert certain facts and you seek a certain prayer. The other side is required to respond to that, which is referred to as a written statement. On the basis of the pleadings and the documents filed along with the pleadings, what is called as a framing of issues happens. So, what is a real bone of contention between the parties, and that is crystallized. So, therefore, they will be the issues on which both parties are required to lead evidence, and whoever comes to court to assert a particular existence of a fact is required under law to prove that fact. Now, what was it that the claims were made by the Hindus? The 16th January 1950 suit merely asked for an injunction restraining anybody from disturbing them from worshipping the idol which has been kept under the central dome or which has appeared or on the intervening night of 22nd and 23rd December 1949. So that interim injunction was granted and that continued. Later, a suit was filed by the Sunni Waqf Board in 1961. They come to court and assert a fact that Babur conquered Oudh and built this grand mosque for the worshippers on a vacant land. So basically, their suit is on an edifice that the place was a vacant land on which, like Mr. Conrad had mentioned, they either acquired that land or probably they had title to the land as a government. So that was their assertion. Now, when Ramlala Virajman filed a suit, that is the DT himself, because the English, when they introduced their legal system to India, they couldn't figure out how a deity which owns vast extents of properties, like most of our temples, are endowed with a large extents of lands. So, to understand the concept of ownership, there is something called a juristic person in law. Like, as commerce students here would know, there's a company which is creation of a statute. So similarly, a legal concept has been created of a juristic person. So India always had this concept of a mata or a guild or a ashrama, which could acquire or retain title over mobile and immobile properties. So Ramlala Virajman as a living deity, the British or the common law recognizes a minor as a person whose care has to be taken care by a next friend or the court itself. He comes to court as a minor and seeks the court's assistance in recovering the entire land so that a temple could be built there. So these are the three broad issues on which the court had gone to trial on. Now, the evidence which was required to be established by the Muslim side was that there existed a vacant land on which this masjid was built. On the face of it, anyone who had visited the structure could notice that it was domes were built using the Kasauti pillars, which were clearly depicting Hindu symbols. So, therefore, there was no question of a mosque being built with pillars which had symbols which are replicating idols, because it is considered as impermissible in Islam or Sharia. So idol worship is actually antithesis to the Sharia. So therefore, on Sharia also, the Hindus led evidence to say that this could not have been a mosque under Sharia. So the Supreme Court decided that we are not experts on theology. We will not get into the questions of either Sharia law or probably the Puranas which have been cited. So what they chose to do instead was to examine the existence of the faith of Hindus, that this place is the place of birth, because the existence of faith is acknowledged and it could be established, because faith is not required to be proved, because it is beyond your comprehension of proof through your sensory organs. It is referred to as faith because you actually believe it is existing, though you don't have any scientific evidence which can be probably tangibly produced in a court of law. It is in that sense the existence of faith is all that it was required to prove. And as I had mentioned earlier, there was ample evidence which showed that this place has been believed to be the place of birth of Ram by several generations of Muslims who lived in Ayodhya, the travelers as much. And on the other side, the Muslim side could not establish existence of any kind of worship prior to 1850s. So they actually admit in court, and it's recorded in the Supreme Court judgment, that there's no evidence of any namaz being offered prior to 1850s by the Muslims. So it's clearly established that they couldn't establish that the mosque was built on a vacant land on evidence. They couldn't lead any evidence. In fact, they made a statement, we have no evidence pre 1850. So it boiled down to only question of the existence of faith and whether the Muslims had acquired something called a possessory title on adverse possession. Even on that count, they felt that the Hindus kept worshipping in the place. Even after an artificial partition was made in the building, a railing was kept. The Muslims were allowed to access the central dome and the other two places, and the Hindus were asked to wait outside the railing and worship from there. So even then, the Muslim muezzins, etc., admitted that the Hindus would come, stand at the railing, look into the central dome, worship there, make their offerings there outside the grill, and then walk away. So their belief of that place being the place of birth was established beyond any doubt. And the test is only preponderance of probabilities in a civil suit, not beyond reasonable doubt, which is required in case of a criminal trial.
Fascinating, I must say. There's a lot that we would like to know in order to be more educated about why Ram Janmabhoomi is so significant. Especially you young people should know and read more about it. But now I think we are running out of time, so I can quickly take two questions from the audience for both the guests here.
My question is to Professor Elst.
Yes.
Jai Shri Ram, sir. We are seeing a fight between the traditional wing of Hinduism and the new Savarkarite Hindutva. In Twitter we call trads and non-trads. So, what's the future of these thoughts in civilization nation like us?
Yes, I didn't get your question entirely, but I know it's about trads and non-trads. Okay. So yes, among traditionalists, you find some positions that are not very helpful and that can easily be used by the enemy side to lampoon Hinduism as such. Remember the Nupur Sharma debate. This was with some Muslim spokesman, Taslim Rahmani. So for him, it was very easy to make fun of the Shiva Lingam because that has sexual connotations and so on. It's easy to make jokes about that. Okay. Now, here about the enormous exaggerations posited by the traditionalists, it's also easy to make fun. To say that Rama lived in the Treta Yuga, which is 864 years before Krishna. Okay, so Rama lived 900,000 years ago. Now, there were no chariots at that time. There were no copper and so on from which to make swords. And so, I mean, this is totally nonsense, right, to say that. And so, this, I mean, I notice it now on Twitter and so on. In the past, when you talked with people face to face, you would have a human sort of interaction that you sort of take into account the sensibilities of the other person. You don't go too far. But on Twitter, somehow, behind a computer screen, people lose all inhibitions. And so there you can see what the traditionalists really think. And so it's easy to make fun of that. And so I don't agree with them. Let that be clear.
The dichotomy of the thing is that between the legal and the social,
Mhm.
there is, I mean, the way we view
Yeah.
the entire interaction or reaction between the two faiths
Mhm.
is so different. Is so different. Another question.
Good evening, sir. So my question is to Professor Els. So you said that historically the battle has been won, but following the 90s, I mean, what transpired in on 6th December, didn't the movement attain a more of a political character than the cultural or the religious or the historical aspect, and even the historiography hasn't been so much mainstreamed amongst the masses. So did that political nature help the movement or
Well, it was already quite politicized before 6 December. So that didn't make a difference. Of course, it was a bit of a sensational event, not only for the secularists. It was a reaction by the Karsevaks against the delays and the lack of seriousness of both the Supreme Court, that had promised a verdict and didn't give one, and of the BJP, that had supported this movement. And then, after they won the elections in 89 and in 91, becoming the second national political party, then they dropped it like a hot potato, which it had become in the meantime. It had become a strongly polarizing thing. And so they feared that something bad was going to happen. So the Karsevaks took the law into their own hand. But you see, that of course makes no difference at all to the history of the site. What happened in 1500 is not affected by what happened in 1992. So the issue remains the same. Of course, it created even more enemies to the Hindu narrative abroad, but they were already hostile. I mean, I can testify. In 1990, I was at the International Ramayana Conference, which at that year happened to take place exactly in my own home university. And so there I defended, obviously there was a temple there. I was puked out, all these big time professors, they didn't want to have anything to do with this. This is Hindutva and fascist and all the rest. And they had not studied the thing at all. And indeed, as the evidence has shown, they were wrong, but they were the majority. Absolutely. They had the institutions, they had the establishment behind them. But really, you see, for the historical facts, that made no difference.
We need to free the education system from the politics. uh, you have a question? Yes, please.
My question
Take a mic. Take a mic, please. Yeah.
Good evening, sir, and good evening, ma'am. My question is to both of you, and it is that how you perceive Sri Ram as. Like for us, all of us, we believe him in different forms. For all of us, he has different meanings, different connotations. So, how you, as an author, as an historian, believe him, and how you, as a legal scholar, believe him, or how you perceive him in your respective domains.
Mhm.
Would you like to
Yeah.
go first?
Okay. Well, first of all, what I think of it is not really important for the right of his worshippers to worship him. Okay. So whether I am a Muslim or a secularist or whatever, that right I think should be guaranteed by any secular state. Now, what I personally think, is really not important. But okay, I'll tell you. So I think Rama was a historical figure. He was a member of the Solar dynasty, and he was a very powerful king. He's mentioned once in one of the last verses of the Rig Veda, where he's in a Dana Stuti, a praise of the donors. So he's praised for generously subsidizing the poets. So he's a historical figure. He had certain virtues that were worth writing a poem about. And so, looking at it from a distance, you might say, well, what he did was to maintain dharma, to restore dharma. And so, in the world of the gods, that is the role of Vishnu. You have Brahma, the creator, and Shiva, the destroyer. Well, Vishnu is the maintainer of dharma. And that's what Rama did on earth, and what later also Krishna did on earth. So they are, you could say, figuratively speaking, they are incarnations of Vishnu. Now, some people take that a bit too literally for my taste, but again, that's not so important.
If I had to respond to that, I mean, I would take it literally. My name is Sridhar. My father's name is Sriram. And the founder of this institution is Sridhar Sriram. And it is no coincidence that tomorrow morning I'm going to Ayodhya to be part of the Pran Pratishtha. And today I was designated as a senior counsel a few hours back by the Supreme Court of India. And I come to an institution which is called Sridhar Sriram's founded. So now, if I look at it from a spiritual perspective, the first assignment which unknowingly had accepted to come here in the evening, and I requested this session to be shifted from 1 to 5 because I thought I'll be engaged or caught up in the court. It so happened that on my way I got to know the news. Now, for me, as a spiritual person, I believe that this is no coincidence because there are no coincidences according to me as a believer. Secondly, now if I had asked myself this question, actually had come to my mind when I was into this matter as a professional. I had to retain my faith where it belongs and also bring in my objectivity as a trained lawyer. So the question which comes to my mind is, like, I have traveled with my parents across the length and breadth of the country. The same story of the same characters is told everywhere. There could be some improvisations or probably the local versions which would have added up to something, but the core essence, probably the structure of the story remains the same. The characters are the same. Now, how is it possible that in an era where there was no communication technology, transport was not easy, that the length and breadth of the country knew the same story in multiple languages where they don't even have interaction of transport or technology to communicate in the same format, and the places are clearly identified geographically where we visit, and then the local gatha or story is there, the Sthala Purana as we refer to. So therefore, there's something more to it, that this land is no wonder is referred to as a karma bhumi. It's considered a privilege to have been born in this land, because in this land we have a culture which sustained a targeted pillage, iconoclasm, and genocides over hundreds of years, but they just could not decimate it. The fact that we are here discussing and objectively discussing our own identities shows the diversity that is encouraged in our intellectual space. It was always the case, and the places which were targeted were always, as I referred to, I mean, I call temples as the mothers of the society. Like a mother takes care of all the requirements of a family as a unit in diverse forms. The previous session about the women in profession and then probably in multiple roles. I'm a son of a working woman. My mother was working much before we were born. She raised 3 children as a banker. And then I'm here before you, thanks to my mother's blessings. How else do I see it? A working woman. And at the same time, she also inculcates certain values in us, apart from economically supporting the family, apart from ensuring we get our anna. So these are all multiple things which happen, which are integrated. See, the modern rational mind may not have explanations. Science may not have actually explanations. So that is where your faith begins. According to me, the faith begins where science fails or has no explanation. And science is evolving. And therefore, it is able to explain as it actually explains things more rationally. I mean, we have our own Maharshis who are explaining phenomenon in a scientific temper. But unfortunately, because of lack of education or otherwise, they were made into rituals or probably superstitions. We lost the science or the rationale behind it, and therefore we are ridiculed for our superstitions.
Sir, sir, is Prana Prasistha Prime Minister's Ashwamedha movement?
That's a
Well,
beautiful question.
Ashwamedha movement, I really am not a scholar on Yajna Shastra. So I think I would join you as a layman on that and said probably yes. Or a Rajasuya.
I think a person of any faith, any ideology across, the country, would come together and celebrate this moment that we are going to witness and are witness to. I thank you all for a patient hearing in this cold weather. I do hope that you young minds take this, consciousness forward, the dharmic consciousness forward, and make it a forever Ayodhya for the generations to come. Thank you so much. Thank you, Poduraju sir. Thank you, Professor Conrad. That was really, really a very insightful and engaging discussion. Thank you so much. Thank you to all.